The dust of Terminus was a living thing, a fine red powder that coated the tongue, gritted in the eyes, and settled like a shroud over the spirit. For the girl they called Mai, it was the taste of the end of the world. She stood on a crude wooden platform, the midday sun a hammer against her skull. Iron cuffs, linked by a heavy chain, bit into the delicate skin of her wrists. They were a cold, constant reminder of her status, property. Cargo. Less than human. The faces in the crowd below were a blur of leering curiosity and casual cruelty. They were miners, trappers, and drifters, men whose souls had been scoured as raw as the landscape. They saw her fine-boned features, her fall of ink-black hair matted with dirt, the silk of her torn tunic, and they saw an exotic novelty, a diversion from the bleakness of their lives. Her terror was a silent, screaming thing in her chest. Every shouted bid, every coarse joke, was another lash against her already flayed dignity. She had been torn from her home, a place of soft rains and green hills, and dragged across an ocean and a continent to this godless expanse of rock and heat. Her family was a ghost, her language a useless relic. All she had left was a fear so profound it had burned away everything else. Then, she saw him. He stood at the edge of the crowd, apart from the rest. He was tall and lean, weathered by the same sun and wind that had carved the canyons, but he stood with a stillness that was utterly alien to the restless energy of the town. He wore dusty, plain clothes, a wide-brimmed hat shadowing a face that gave nothing away. He wasn't looking at her the way the others were. There was no avarice in his gaze, no hunger. It was a look of quiet, unnerving assessment, as if he were measuring the grain of a piece of wood or judging the heft of a stone. He did not shout or jostle for position. He simply watched, his presence a pocket of silence in the cacophony. The auctioneer, a corpulent man sweating through his waistcoat, tried to incite a bidding war. "Look at her, boys. Straight from the Orient. A real lotus blossom for the taking." The man at the edge of the crowd did not react. He remained motionless as the price climbed from $3 to $5, then stalled at $7. Mai's heart hammered against her ribs. Who would claim her? The fat merchant with the wet, pursed lips? The wiry trapper with yellowed teeth and a possessive gleam in his eye? She closed her eyes, praying for an oblivion that would not come. The auctioneer was growing impatient. $7, going once, going twice, a voice, low and rough as scraped leather, cut through the air. 10. It wasn't loud, but it carried with an authority that silenced the murmuring. All heads turned toward the quiet man. He had not moved, but he had shifted the very gravity of the moment. He pulled a small leather pouch from his belt, his movements deliberate. The auctioneer's eyes lit with greed. $10 from the stranger. A solid bid. Any advance on 10? There was none. The other men grumbled, shuffling their feet. There was something about the stranger that discouraged competition. A finality. Sold, the auctioneer boomed, slamming his gavel down. To the tall fella for $10 silver the sound was a death knell. The stranger stepped forward, untying his pouch. He counted out the coins, their clink against the wood of the auctioneer's table, the sound of her life being signed away. He took the key from the auctioneer, his gaze finally meeting Mai's. For the first time, she saw his eyes beneath the shadow of his hat. They were the color of a winter sky, pale and clear and deep. And in them, she saw not possession, but something else she could not name. It was not kindness, not yet. It was a profound and desolate weariness, a mirror of the emptiness in her own soul. He unlocked the chain from the post, leaving the cuffs on her wrists, and with a slight, almost imperceptible nod, indicated for her to follow. She stepped off the platform, her legs trembling, into the custody of a ghost. His name, she would learn much later, was Silas. But for now, he was only a presence, a force that moved with a quiet economy of motion. He led her away from the jeering crowd, his long strides forcing her into a stumbling trot to keep up. The heavy chain connecting her wrist swung with each step, a cruel pendulum marking the seconds of her new, unknown captivity. He did not look back. He moved through the squalid main street of Terminus as if it were nothing more than an obstacle, his focus fixed on the vast, empty horizon that stretched beyond the last wretched shanty. He stopped at a livery stable, the air thick with the smell of hay and manure. A single horse, a sturdy roan with intelligent eyes, was tethered to a post. It nickered softly as Silas approached, nudging his shoulder with its muzzle. He stroked the horse's neck, his touch surprisingly gentle. It was the first sign of tenderness she had seen from him, an interaction more expressive than any word he might have spoken. He saddled the horse with practiced efficiency, his movements sure and unhurried. Mai stood by, a silent, shackled shadow, her mind a whirlwind of terror. What fresh hell awaited her? The stories she had overheard on the long, brutal journey whispered of men in the wilderness, men who bought girls like her for purposes she dared not let her mind complete. When the horse was ready, he turned to her. She flinched, expecting a blow, a rough hand. Instead, he simply looked at the chain between her wrists, then at the height of the saddle. With a grunt, he went to his saddlebags and returned with a heavy file. He gestured for her hands. Trembling, she held them out. He took the connecting chain, not her wrists, and with a few swift, powerful strokes, sawed through the central link. The chain fell away in 2 pieces, clattering into the dust. He had not freed her, not completely, the iron cuffs remained, but he had severed the heaviest part of her bondage. He had given her back the use of her hands. It was a small thing, a practical thing, yet it felt monumental. It was an act of mercy so unexpected it was disorienting. He then cupped his hands to give her a boost onto the horse. She hesitated for a fraction of a second before placing her worn slipper into his calloused palms. He lifted her into the saddle with an easy strength, then swung up behind her. She sat rigid, her back pressed against his chest, the heat of his body a terrifying, solid reality. He clicked his tongue, and the horse moved forward, carrying them out of Terminus and into the unforgiving wilderness. The landscape that unfolded before them was vast and brutal, a tableau of cracked earth and scorched rock under a mercilessly white sky. It was a land that promised nothing but hardship, an emptiness that echoed the hollow space inside her. And as they rode deeper into it, away from the only world she had known for months, she felt a new kind of fear, not of a leering crowd, but of the profound, unreadable silence of the man who now owned her. The first night was a trial of silence. They rode until the sun bled out across the western mesas, painting the sky in violent hues of orange and purple. Silas chose a campsite in the shelter of a low, rocky bluff that offered some protection from the ceaseless wind. He slid from the horse, then reached up to help her down, his hands firm and impersonal on her waist. He released her the moment her feet touched the ground. He set about his tasks with a methodical grace, unsaddling the horse and rubbing it down before tethering it to graze on a patch of hardy scrub. Mai huddled near a large boulder, drawing her knees to her chest, making herself as small as possible. She watched his every move, her senses stretched taut. He gathered dry brush and, with a flint and steel, coaxed a small, efficient fire to life. The flames leaped up, a tiny beacon of warmth and light against the encroaching darkness and the immensity of the plains. The fire was a paradox, she thought. It held the power to destroy, to consume, but it also offered comfort, a defense against the cold and the things that lurked in the night. Like the man who had built it. He took out a parcel wrapped in oilcloth. Inside was salted beef jerky and a round of hardtack. He broke the biscuit in 2 and held a piece out to her, along with a strip of the dried meat. She stared at his outstretched hand, at the offering. Her stomach clenched with a hunger she had almost forgotten, but her fear was stronger. He held it there for a long moment, patient, his expression unreadable in the flickering firelight. When she didn't move, he simply placed the food on the rock beside her, then retreated to his side of the fire with his own portion. He ate slowly, his gaze fixed on the flames. After he finished, he offered her the water skin. This time, she took it, her fingers brushing his for a fleeting second. The contact sent a jolt through her, not of revulsion, but of surprise. His skin was rough, but his touch was steady. She drank deeply, the cool water a balm to her parched throat. He had fed her. He had given her water. He had not spoken a single word. As the stars began to pierce the velvet blackness of the sky, he laid out his bedroll on one side of the fire. He set his rifle down beside it, within easy reach. Then he lay down, his back to her, and seemed to fall asleep almost instantly. I did not sleep. She sat clutching her own portion of the food, the hard biscuit a solid, real thing in her trembling hands. She watched the steady rise and fall of his shoulders. He had not touched her. He had not forced her. He had not even demanded a word of gratitude. He had simply provided. The fear remained, a cold knot in her belly, but it was no longer the all-consuming terror of Terminus. It was being slowly eroded by a profound and unsettling confusion. This man was her master. He had bought her. Yet he treated her with a strange, detached respect that was more baffling than cruelty. In the immense, hostile silence of the plains, under the indifferent gaze of a million stars, she began to eat, the salty tang of the meat and the bland crunch of the biscuit, the first taste of a life she could not yet begin to comprehend. The journey stretched into days, each one a repetition of the last. They rode under the vast, empty sky, the rhythm of the horse's gait a lulling constant. The silence between them became a language of its own, a space filled with the whisper of the wind, the cry of a distant hawk, and the soft creak of leather. Mai learned to anticipate the routine, the morning ritual of breaking camp, the midday stop for water and a sparse meal, the evening ritual of making the fire. Silas remained an enigma, a man carved from the same stoic material as the landscape itself. He spoke only when necessary, his words brief and functional, pointing out a hazard on the trail or giving a soft command to the horse. She began to observe the small details. The way he checked the horse's hooves every evening without fail. The way his eyes, a startling pale blue against his sun-darkened skin, constantly scanned the horizon, missing nothing. He was a man attuned to the wilderness, a part of it. He was not a monster. The realization dawned on her slowly, cautiously. He was simply alone. A deep, profound solitude seemed to cling to him like the dust on his coat. On the third day, the sky turned against them. The brilliant blue bruised to a leaden grey, and the wind rose to a mournful howl. A storm was coming, a prairie thunderstorm of terrifying violence. Silas spurred the horse onward, his urgency palpable. He found shelter just as the first fat drops of rain began to fall, a deep overhang of rock carved into the side of a mesa. He dismounted quickly and pulled her down into the dry space just as the heavens opened. The rain came down in a solid, grey sheet, obscuring the world, and lightning spider-webbed across the sky, followed by peals of thunder that seemed to shake the very ground beneath them. The sudden deluge had soaked her thin tunic, and she began to shiver violently, the cold seeping into her bones. Silas, busy securing the horse, looked over at her. He saw her huddled form, her chattering teeth. Without a word, he unfastened his heavy oilskin coat and draped it over her shoulders. It was heavy and smelled of dust, leather, and him. But it was warm, a shield against the biting wind and her own fear. They were trapped in the small space, the storm forcing a proximity that was more intimate than any they had shared before. She could feel the heat radiating from his body, see the lines of exhaustion etched around his eyes. It was then, in the strange, flickering light of the storm, that he seemed to notice the raw, chafed flesh of her wrists where the iron cuffs had rubbed them raw. Her skin was red and weeping, a stark testament to her ordeal. His expression, for just a moment, tightened. A flicker of something, anger, perhaps, or pity, crossed his features before being suppressed. He turned to his saddlebags, rummaged inside, and produced a small, flat tin. He opened it and set it down on the ground near her, then pushed it closer with the toe of his boot. It was a salve, its herbal scent cutting through the damp air. He did not make a move to apply it for her. He did not touch her. He simply provided the means, leaving the choice, the action, to her. It was an act of profound respect. He was acknowledging her pain but also her agency. It was a gesture that said, "This is yours to tend to. You have control over your own body." Hesitantly, she picked up the tin. She dipped her fingers into the cool, greasy ointment and began to gently apply it to her savaged wrists. The salve stung at first, a sharp, clean pain, but then a soothing numbness began to spread. As she tended to her own wounds, something shifted inside her. It was the first time since her capture that she had been able to offer herself any form of care. And it was him, this silent, inscrutable man, who had given her that opportunity. She looked up at him through the curtain of her wet hair. He was staring out at the storm, his profile stark against the grey light, but she knew he was aware of her. In that small, sheltered space, with the world raging around them, a fragile, unspoken understanding passed between them. He was not just her keeper. He was, in his own stark and silent way, her protector. They arrived at his home on the 5th day. It was not the grand ranch she might have imagined, nor the squalid hovel she might have feared. It was something in between, something that was as stark and solitary as the man himself. Built into the protective curve of a sun-bleached bluff, the cabin was small and sturdy, constructed of thick, hand-hewn logs chinked with mud. It looked less like a house and more like a fortress, a bulwark against the vast, indifferent wilderness. A thin curl of smoke rose from a stone chimney, suggesting a fire left banked and waiting. A small, well-tended corral stood nearby, along with a woodshed and a deep, stone-lined well. There was a sense of permanence here, of a life carved out through sheer will and persistence. Silas dismounted and, for the first time, gestured for her to precede him. She walked toward the heavy wooden door, her heart a wild drum against her ribs. This was it. The destination. The place where her fate would be decided. He pushed the door open, and it swung inward on leather hinges. The inside was a single, large room, spare and meticulously clean. A stone fireplace dominated one wall, its hearth swept clean. A rough-hewn table and 2 chairs stood in the center. Shelves holding tins, sacks of flour, and a few books lined another wall. It was the home of a man who possessed little but took care of what he had. In the corner, a space was curtained off with a heavy blanket. He walked over and pulled the curtain aside, revealing a small alcove. Inside was a simple cot with a clean, folded quilt, a small crate for a table, and a single candle in a holder. He looked at her, then pointed to the alcove. He turned back to the main room, to the larger cot that was clearly his own. The meaning was unmistakable. He was giving her her own space, her own privacy. It was a boundary, a sign of respect she could never have anticipated. He then walked to a sturdy chest in the corner and took out the file he had used on the journey, along with a small hammer and a wedge. He approached her slowly, as one might approach a frightened animal. "Your hands," he said. His voice was a low rumble, the first words he had spoken to her that were not a simple command or observation. Trembling, she held out her wrists. He knelt before her, the firelight catching the grey in his hair at his temples. He worked with intense, patient concentration, inserting the wedge into the lock of one cuff and tapping it gently with the hammer. The process was slow, painstaking. She could feel the vibrations through her bones. She watched the focused line of his brow, the strength in his hands as he worked not to harm, but to free. Finally, with a sharp crack, the first cuff sprang open and fell to the floor with a metallic clang. He did not pause, moving immediately to the other. A few minutes later, it too fell away. The sudden lightness of her arms was dizzying. She raised her hands, turning them over and over, staring at the bruised, raw skin. The brand of her servitude was still visible, but the iron was gone. She was unbound. He stood up, gathering the cuffs and the broken chain. He walked to the fire and, without ceremony, tossed them into the flames. They glowed red, then white-hot, the metal slowly surrendering its shape, being unmade. He turned back to her, his pale eyes meeting hers across the room. "You are safe here," he said, and the simple declaration landed with the force of a covenant. The days that followed settled into a rhythm dictated by the sun and the seasons, a life measured in silence and routine. Silas would rise before dawn, the quiet sounds of him stoking the fire and preparing coffee a gentle alarm. He would work outside from sunup to sundown, tending his small herd of cattle that grazed in the valley below, mending fences, or chopping wood. He was a man in constant, purposeful motion. Mai, in turn, began to tentatively claim the space he had given her. At first, she did nothing, simply watching from the doorway of the cabin or the privacy of her alcove, terrified of doing the wrong thing, of overstepping some invisible boundary. but the idleness chafed at her. She had always been a person of purpose, her hands always busy. Hesitantly, she began to take over the tasks of the cabin. She swept the wooden floor until it was smooth and clean. She learned to bake bread, a dense, hearty loaf, in the hearth oven. She found his mending kit, a small collection of needles and rough thread, and began to repair the tears in his work shirts, her stitches small and neat. She would leave the mended garment folded on his chair, and he would wear it the next day without comment, but she would see him run his thumb over the neat seam, a silent acknowledgement. Their communication became a tapestry woven from these small, wordless actions. He would leave a bucket of fresh milk from his single cow by the door, she would leave a bowl of warm stew on the table for his return. He brought her a length of soft blue calico cloth he'd purchased on a rare trip to a distant trading post. She painstakingly sewed it into a simple, comfortable dress, the first garment she had owned that was not a reminder of her past. Behind the cabin, she discovered a small, fallow patch of earth that caught the morning sun. It was protected from the wind by the bluff, the soil dark and rich. In his stores, she found small canvas bags containing seeds, beans, squash, and hardy greens. A powerful, primal urge rose within her, the need to grow something, to nurture life in this stark land. She found a spade and began to turn the soil, her hands, now soft and healing, digging into the cool earth. Silas watched her from a distance, leaning against the corral fence, his expression unreadable. He did not interfere, did not question. The next day, he left 2 large buckets of water by the patch of tilled earth. It was his blessing, his contribution to her project. Tending to the small garden became her sanctuary. She watered the seedlings, pulled the weeds, and watched with a fierce, protective pride as the first green shoots pushed their way through the soil. It was her own act of creation. She was no longer just a survivor, buffeted by fate. She was putting down roots, coaxing life from the unforgiving ground. The silence in the cabin was no longer the tense, fearful quiet of the journey. It had transformed into a comfortable, companionable stillness. It was the quiet of 2 solitary people sharing a space, respecting each other's solitude. She learned the landscape of his face, the way his eyes crinkled at the corners when a calf was born, the hard set of his jaw when a storm threatened the herd. He, in turn, learned the quiet language of her presence, the smell of baking bread that greeted him at dusk, the small wildflowers she sometimes placed in a jar on the table, a splash of color in their monochrome world. They were building a life, not with words or promises, but with shared labor, mutual respect, and the slow, steady weaving of one day into the next. The trust between them was not a thing that had been given, but a thing that had been grown, as slow and as patient as her garden. The peace was a fragile, precious thing, and she had known, on some deep, instinctual level, that it could not last. The world that had brutalized her was still out there, beyond the sheltering arms of the bluff. The intrusion came on a hot afternoon in late summer. Mai was weeding her garden, the sun warm on her back, when the sound reached her, the distant, rhythmic beat of approaching horses. It was a sound that did not belong to their secluded world. Her blood ran cold. She stood up, shielding her eyes, and saw them, 3 riders cresting the far ridge, dark silhouettes against the bright sky. A primal fear, the kind she had not felt since Terminus, seized her. Silas was by the corral, replacing a broken rail. He had heard it too. He went still, his head lifting like a wolf scenting danger. He dropped his tools and walked to the edge of the rise, his body a tense line of vigilance. As the riders drew closer, a sickening wave of recognition washed over Mai. The man in the lead, thick-set and arrogant in the saddle, was Barlow, the man who had run the auction, the man whose leering face was burned into her memory. Her sanctuary was about to be violated. Silas turned and strode back toward the cabin, his movement swift and purposeful. The quiet man she had come to know had vanished, replaced by someone harder, colder, and infinitely more dangerous. "Inside," he said, his voice flat and hard as stone. "Get inside and stay away from the window." She didn't hesitate, scrambling into the cabin, her heart pounding a frantic rhythm against her ribs. He followed her in, taking his rifle down from the hooks above the fireplace. He checked the load with an efficiency that spoke of long, grim familiarity. He was no simple homesteader. He was a man who knew violence. "They will not take you," he said, not looking at her, his focus entirely on the approaching threat. It wasn't a promise meant to soothe, it was a statement of fact, a declaration of war. He moved to the door, positioning himself just inside the frame, the long barrel of the rifle resting lightly in his hands. Through a crack in the rough-hewn logs, Mai watched the riders approach. Barlow, his face flushed with heat and arrogance. The other two were the kind of men who followed him, cruel, empty-eyed, predators drawn to the scent of weakness. They reined in their horses a few yards from the cabin, their casual posture a calculated display of dominance. The test had arrived. The world had come to reclaim her. And she was about to discover who Silas truly was, her protector, or simply a man defending his property. "Silas!" Barlow's voice was a greasy sneer that slid through the hot, still air. "I knew we'd find you holed up out here. Heard you'd settled down. Didn't figure you for the domestic type." Silas did not answer. He remained a still, silent silhouette in the doorway. Barlow's gaze flickered past him, trying to peer into the shadows of the cabin. "We've come on business, Silas. A simple misunderstanding. That piece of property you bought back in Terminus, turns out her value has appreciated. A businessman in Calvert's Crossing is willing to pay a premium. A significant premium." He paused, letting the words hang in the air. "I'm prepared to buy her back from you. Double what you paid." A fair profit for a few weeks' trouble. The casual way he spoke of her, as a commodity, a thing to be traded, sent a fresh wave of nausea through Mai. But this time, something else mingled with the fear, a cold, hard anger. Inside the cabin, her eyes darted around the small space. She was not the same girl who had stood on that platform. She had known safety here, and respect. She would not be dragged back into the darkness. Her gaze fell on the small, sharp hunting knife Silas used for skinning hides, lying on a shelf near the hearth. Her hand closed around the wooden handle, the cold steel a shocking comfort. Silas's voice, when it came, was dangerously low. "She is not for sale now, don't be like that," Barlow chuckled, a humorless sound. "Everything's for sale out here. You know that better than anyone. Don't tell me you've gone soft. Just send the girl out. We'll settle up and be on our way." "No need for trouble, this is her home," Silas stated, each word a stone dropped into a deep well. "She stays." "You leave." Barlow's face hardened, the false geniality falling away to reveal the raw greed beneath. "That's my property you've got in there, Silas. I've got a bill of sale. You're harboring a runaway." "I've got the right." He shifted in his saddle, his hand moving almost casually toward the pistol holstered at his hip. "Last chance. Send her out. There's no law out here but what a man makes for himself," Silas said, his voice dropping to a near whisper. "And you are not welcome on my land." The world seemed to hold its breath. The air grew thick and heavy. Mai, clutching the knife, pressed herself against the wall, her knuckles white. She watched Barlow's eyes, saw the decision flicker there. He was a man who only understood the language of force. Barlow's hand moved. It was not a casual shift anymore. It was a draw. But he was too slow. The rifle in Silas's hands bucked once, the sound a deafening crack that shattered the afternoon quiet. Barlow jerked in the saddle, a dark stain blossoming on his chest, his expression one of pure, stupid surprise before he toppled sideways and hit the ground in a cloud of dust. The other two men, shocked into action, fumbled for their own weapons. The fight was over before it truly began, a blur of smoke and thunderous noise, decisive and brutal, leaving only the ringing silence and the metallic scent of blood in its wake. The echo of the final shot faded into the vastness of the prairie, leaving a silence that felt heavier and more profound than any that had come before. For a long moment, nothing moved. The dust settled. A horse, riderless, shied away and galloped toward the horizon. Mai stood frozen inside the cabin, the knife still clutched in her hand, her mind struggling to process the swift, terrible violence. Then, she saw Silas sway. He leaned heavily against the doorframe, the rifle slipping from his grasp to clatter on the floor. A dark patch was spreading rapidly across the sleeve of his left arm. He was hurt. The sight broke her paralysis. The fear that had held her captive dissolved, replaced by an urgent, overwhelming wave of concern. She dropped the knife and rushed to his side. "You are hurt," she said, her voice shaking but clear. He grunted, pressing his good hand against the wound, his face pale beneath its tan. "It's nothing," but it wasn't nothing. Blood was seeping through his fingers, dripping onto the clean-swept floorboards. For the first time, she saw him as vulnerable. The invincible, stoic man was made of flesh and blood, and his blood was being spilled for her. In that moment, the last vestiges of their original dynamic, owner and owned, rescuer and rescued, crumbled into dust. They were simply two people in a crisis, and he needed her. Without hesitation, she took command. "Sit," she ordered, her tone gentle but firm. To her surprise, he obeyed, slumping into one of the chairs by the table, his head bowed. She ran to her alcove and tore a long, clean strip from the hem of the calico dress he had given her. She fetched water from the bucket and knelt before him. Gently, she pushed his hand away from the wound. A bullet had torn through the fleshy part of his upper arm. It was a clean wound, but it was bleeding freely. Her hands, which had once been shackled, now moved with deft purpose. She cleaned the wound as best she could, her touch light. He winced but did not pull away. He watched her, his pale eyes dark with pain and something else, a raw, unguarded astonishment. He was seeing her, truly seeing her, perhaps for the first time, not as a fragile thing he needed to protect, but as a person of strength and capability. She wrapped the wound tightly with a strip of calico, fashioning a pressure bandage. Her movements were sure, her focus absolute. The roles had been completely inverted. She was no longer the helpless victim. She was the caretaker, the healer. Her small garden had taught her to nurture life, now she was tending to his. When she was finished, she looked up and met his gaze. The space between them was charged with unspoken emotion. The violence he had committed on her behalf, and her immediate, instinctual care for him, had forged a new and unbreakable link in their bond. It was a connection sealed not in the quiet comfort of their shared life, but in the crucible of shared threat and mutual dependency. He had defended her life with his own. She was now defending his in return. He raised his good hand and, for the first time, touched her face, his calloused thumb gently stroking her cheek. It was not a gesture of ownership, but one of profound, wordless gratitude. In the quiet aftermath of the storm, surrounded by the evidence of the world's brutality, they had found their true sanctuary, not in the cabin, not in the land, but in each other. Time healed the wound in his arm, and it healed the raw tear in the fabric of their peace. Silas buried the men on a far ridge, a grim task he performed alone, shielding her from its finality. The incident was never spoken of again. The words were unnecessary. The memory of it lived in the new quiet between them, a quiet no longer born of uncertainty, but of a deep, unshakable knowledge of one another. The garden flourished under her care. The squash grew fat on the vine, and the beans climbed their poles with tenacious vigor. It was a riot of life, a testament to her resilience, a defiant splash of green against the dun-colored landscape. Their life resumed its familiar rhythm, but its foundation had shifted. It was now a partnership, unspoken but absolute. They moved around each other with an intuitive grace, anticipating needs, sharing tasks, their individual solitudes merging into a shared existence. One evening, as the autumn chill began to creep into the air, they sat before a crackling fire. The day's labor was done. A stew, rich with vegetables from her garden, simmered on the hearth. Silas had been working on something for days, a small block of cartonwood that he whittled at in the quiet hours after supper. He had a surprising delicacy in his large, rough hands. Tonight, he was finished. He held it out to her. It was a bird, a small, intricately carved lark, its head cocked as if listening to a song, its wings poised for flight. The detail was astonishing, every feather rendered with loving precision. It was not an object of value in the way the world measured things. It was infinitely more precious. It was a piece of his time, his attention, his artistry. A gift, freely and wholly given. She took it, her fingers tracing the impossibly smooth wood. It felt warm in her palm. She looked from the small bird to the man who had made it. She saw the lines of hardship on his face, but also the deep well of stillness in his eyes. He was a man who had seen the worst of the world and had chosen to build a pocket of decency in its midst. He had bought her for $10, a transaction of brutal simplicity. But he had not bought her body or her spirit. He had purchased her chance at a future she could never have imagined. He had given her safety when all she had known was terror. He had given her respect when she had been stripped of all dignity. He had given her a home. She looked around the small, sturdy cabin, at the firelight dancing on the log walls, at the shelves holding their shared provisions, at the empty chair where no threat would ever sit again. This was not a prison. It was the entire world. A world built on a foundation of quiet courage and unexpected grace. He had stood between her and the abyss, and in doing so, had shown her that she was strong enough to stand on her own. He had freed her from her shackles, but more than that, he had created a space where she could free herself. She turned back to him, the small wooden bird held carefully in her hands. The words rose from a place deep within her, a place that had been silent for so long. They were not for him as much as they were for herself, a final, quiet acknowledgement of the long, arduous journey that had led her to this exact moment, to this man, to this fire. Her voice was a soft whisper, barely disturbing the stillness of the room, but it held the weight of a lifetime. I found my forever. Silas did not speak. He did not need to. He simply reached out and covered her hand with his touch a silent, powerful affirmation that promised everything. They were home.